Hi, I'm GoTiger, and welcome to part 2 of my tutorial, where we create a custom user interface for use in Warhammer 2. In the first part, we created our images that will be used in our UI. In the second part, we will begin the scripting, which will allow us to show our images on the screen in campaign, and to manipulate those images' position and visibility. So, without any further ado, let's get started. So, our script is going to consist of several different aspects. We will have a section for our declarations, so these are the variables that we need to keep track of certain things. We will have a constructor, so this is the entry point into our script that the game engine will use. We will have a couple of event listeners, where we are listening for the start of turn and the end of turn, and we will have some event handlers to trigger when those events occur. So let's get started by setting up our declarations section. So what variables do we need? Well, the first one that we need to worry about, declarations. So the first one we need to worry about is the local faction that the player is currently playing the game as. So we just want a local, and then we are just simply going to call it local faction name. Oops. Name. Like so. So we will populate this in our constructor, and then that will remain constant for the rest of the script. And we use that to check back at certain times to see whether or not our script should be executing. So what else do we need? Well, the second variable that we need is to keep track of the current state of the progress bar. So if you remember, in the first episode we created 9 images, or rather 9 tiers. We want to keep track of what tier we're currently on. So we will add in a variable called progress bar tier, and that will start at 0. So what else do we need? Well, we want some variables for managing our user interface. So managing when the progress bar is displayed or hidden, and so on. So we will want a local variable called tutorial UI visible, and we're going to set that to true as a default. We then want a second one, which is very similar in name, but at the end of it we go prior to end turn, and we set that true. So I'll explain what these are for in a moment. And then we got one more, which is tutorial UI image, and this is the reference to our actual component. So we default that to nil. Okay, so what do these 3 things do? This first one here is a flag for telling us whether or not the progress bar is visible on the campaign screen. Now, whilst we're declaring it at this point, we won't actually be using it in this first video. It will be used later when we introduce a toggle button for turning the progress bar on and off. The second one that we need is the visible prior to end of turn. Now, I've discovered that even in the scripting language, the Lua, even though you can lock a component into position, that doesn't always stop it from moving around. At the end of turn, there are some things that can happen that can cause your controls to fly off to the middle of the screen and lose their position. So I found that one way of working around this and preventing the seeing that occurring is to, at the end of turn, hide your user control and then keep track of whether or not it was actually visible before the end of turn triggered. And that's where this flag comes in. And if it was visible before the end of turn triggered, then the start turn, we make sure it's visible again. And this third is the reference to our actual progress bar. So when we want to resize or move or hide the progress bar, this is the reference that we use. Okay, so there are the variables that we need for now. We also need a couple of constants. So let's just put in a section for constants. Okay, and our first constant is going to be the position that our progress bar will be displayed at. So to differentiate these, I usually put my constants in all caps. So we're going to have image position X, and we're going to put that at 10 pixels from the left hand side of the screen. Our second constant is going to be position Y, and we're going to put that at 100 pixels from the top of the screen. And that's the only constants we need for the time being. So what's the third thing we need? We need our entry point into our script, and that's where our constructor comes in. So let's create our constructor. So with your constructor, you wanted it to have the same name as your Lua file name, and your Lua file name in the pack file will also need to have that same name. So as you can see, the file name we have here is Warhammer Progress Bar Tutorial, so we will want our function name to be the same as that. So let's create our function, and then it's Warhammer underscore progress bar. Oops, that's not how you spell it. Progress bar, then underscore tutorial, and open and close brackets. Move down a couple, and end. Now, what do we want to do in this constructor? Well, the first thing we want to do is set our local faction name. So local faction name is equal to, and now here we call something called the campaign manager, but you can shortcut reference it using CM. So this is a creative assembly reference in the Lua scripting. So CM, and then one of its functions is get local faction name, and we will pass it true. So that will populate our local faction name variable, which we can use from that point forwards. Another thing that we want to do is set up our event listeners and set up our UI, which is the progress bar itself. But we're not going to do that in the constructor. We're going to do that in two separate functions, but we need to call those functions. So we'll just set the calls for them. So we're going to call init tutorial event listeners, and we're not passing anything into that. And then the second one is init tutorial UI elements, and once again we're not passing anything through. So there we have everything that we need in our constructor for the time being. So what's the next thing we want to do? Well, the next thing we want is to create these two functions that we just referenced. So we'll create a section called functions. Okay, and our first function will be the init tutorial event listeners. So what will this contain? Well, we will initialize a start turn listener and an end turn listener. So let's just create our function. So init tutorial event listeners, there are no parameters. Okay, so the first thing we want to do is using our campaign manager reference, so the CM that's exposed to us by CA. The name of the function we will call is add faction turn start listener by name. Then we'll put an open bracket, close bracket, and end of line. And so in here, there are a couple of parameters that we need to tell it. So the first one is, what is the name of our listener? So we're going to call our listener tutorial progress bar turn start listener. Oops, that's not how you spell it. There we go, turn start listener. So that's the name of our event listener. The second thing we need to give it is the faction that it's going to listen out for. So that will be the local faction reference that we created earlier. The third thing we want to tell it is, what's the name of the function that will handle this event when triggered? So we're going to create a new one, which is on tutorial progress bar turn start, and then the last parameter is just a flag which we can set to true. Now for the end turn, it's slightly different. So instead of using CM, the campaign manager, we actually have to call core, which is another one of the Lewis scripting references that's set up by Creative Assembly. So we can call core and then add listener. And we open our brackets, close our brackets. Alright, so the first thing we need to pass this is much the same as before. We give it the name. So in this case, it's tutorial progress bar, and instead of turn start, it's going to be turn end listener. Now the second parameter here is, what is the event we're listening for? So in this case, we want to know when the faction end turn is triggered. So we type in faction end turn, all one word, like so, then comma, and then on the next line we want to give we want to say we have a function where we can handle certain filters. So we can say we only want it to trigger if it's the player and not the AI that's triggered the end of turn, or if it's a certain faction that's doing it, and so on. So for the time being, we don't really need to worry too much about that. So we will just create the function, and we will just have it return true, because for the time being we don't need to do any filtering, but we will have to come back to that at some point. Now the fourth parameter is very similar to one of the ones we had before, and this is, what is the function that will handle the event being triggered. So we'll have on tutorial underscore progress bar underscore turn end will be the name of our function. And then, much like before, the last parameter is just a flag, which we can set to true. So that's our initialization of our event listeners. Now the second function that we created above was the initialization of our user interface. So let's create the function for that. So function init tutorial UI elements. There are no parameters. So what do we want to do in here? Well, we need to get a reference to the root layout item on the campaign manager, and from that we then get a reference to the layout controller, and then we can put our image onto that layout controller. So the first thing we need to get is that root reference. So local root is equal to, and then so we can use once again one of the Creative Assembly's exposed scripting managers. So it's the core this time. So core get UI root is the function name. Get UI root, and there are no parameters. So that's going to give us a reference to the root. With that reference, we can then go I want to get the layout, and to get the layout is going to be UI component. So we're wrapping what's returned to us in a UI component, and it's going to be root find and then the name of the item we want to find. And we want to find layout. Close the brackets, close the line off. So UI component, and then in brackets, root find, and then the name of the item we're looking for. So now that we should have our reference for layout. Just want to make sure it exists before we continue. So we can just simply say if layout, then we do what we want. So if the reference didn't come back for some reason, we won't end up throwing an error. So tutorial UI image, which is our reference to our actual image progress bar. So we're going to set that is equal to, and then we're going to call another function, which is called add tutorial UI image, and we're going to pass it the layout object, which will be the parent for our item. Okay, so we've got our two initialization functions. However, we've called a new one, add tutorial UI image. So we need to make sure that we create that that function, otherwise the whole thing will crash. So let's create that one. So function add tutorial UI image. So we're passing through the layout, but from the perspective of the add function, the layout is the parent component. So we'll just reference it in this function as parent component, because our progress bar will be a child of that. So the first thing we want to do is we want to grab the image that we're going to be using. So we're going to go image path is a new variable we're creating at the local level, and the path to our image is going to be UI skins tutorial, and then the name of our file, which will be progress underscore bar underscore tier. Yep. We then do a concatenation symbol, which is 2 dots for concatenating strings, and we then get the current progress tier. We then concatenate again, so we can connect to more strings, and we're connecting to PNG. So that will give us the full file name. So our image path is equal to this path inside our pack file, then this file name in this folder, but the file name is completed with the number of the tier and the PNG. So it will become clearer as we look at the pack file. So what else do we need to occur in here? So we've got our image path. The next thing we need to do is actually create our component. So local image component is equal to, now this is where we use a class from the UI modding, I've forgotten the name, the UI modding framework mod. So this image is not provided by CA, it's provided by the UI modding framework, and it's just a wrapper around the UI components, but it makes it easier to work with. So the image, and then there's a function on that called new, and we need to tell it a few things. The first thing we need to tell it is what's the key, what's the name of this item we're creating. So we're going to call it tutorial UI image. The second thing it wants to know is who is the parent of this component I'm going to create. So the parent is the layout object we got earlier, but we treat that in here as parent component. Third thing it wants to know is what's the image I'm going to be displaying, and that's where our image path comes in. And then those are the three things it wants. So we've got our image component now, which has been created with a key. It's been told who its parent is, and it has been told what to display. So the next thing we want to do is set it to the appropriate size and move it to the appropriate position. So we will do if image component. So we want to resize it first of all. So image component, and then there's a function on that we can use called resize, and we want it 90 pixels across, 350 pixels high. Now we could set these two values as constants, and you're welcome to if you want to, but I'm not going to bother for the time being. So we've got our size. The next thing we want to do is set our position. So we go image component, but this time there is no move function for us to call. We need to go to the underlying user control. So we need to go image component.uic, which exposes the underlying user control, and then that has a function called move to, which we can call. And what do we pass that? Well, we pass it the position, the X position and the Y position. So this is where our constants come in, position X and position Y. And that is all we need to do for that function, except for one very important thing, which I almost forgot. We need to return our image component. Now why are we doing that? We're returning the image component that we've just created because up here we are actually saying our tutorial image reference is what's returned from this add function. So what else do we need to do with the image? Well, there's one more function that we need to create, and that's for updating the visibility. So when this image is going to be shown and when it's going to be hidden. So new function, and we call this one update tutorial UI image visibility, and we want to pass through a flag which is am I visible? Pretty simple. So what do we do inside? We check if our tutorial image reference exists, and if it does, then we're just going to call tutorial UI image set visible, which is a function that's exposed by the image object, and we just pass it the flag that we're passing into this function. So we check, does our reference exist? If it does, set the visibility to whatever we've been told it is. So those are our three functions that we need for controlling the image at this point. What are we missing at the moment? Well, we're missing our event handlers. So when a start turn is triggered or an end turn is triggered, we need to handle what's going to happen. So let's create a section for our event handlers. Event handlers. Okay. So our first event handler is for the turn start. So on tutorial progress bar turn start. There are no parameters. So what do we want to do inside this? Well, the first thing we want to do is check our flag. Was the progress bar visible at the end, before the end of turn? And if it was visible before the end of turn, we make sure it's set to visible again now at the start of this next turn. So if tutorial visible prior to end of turn, then this is where we call our update function that we just created, update tutorial UI image visibility, and we set it to true. So if it was visible before the end of turn, we make sure it's visible now. Now, what else do we need to do? Well, we also need to make sure that it's at the correct position. So we check if our reference exists. Then, if it does exist, then we just want to make sure our image is in the correct place. So tutorial UI image, and then we need to call the underlying user control, and then the function move2 on there, and then we set it to our two constants, position X and position Y, like so. So in our turn start, we check, was it visible before the end of turn? If it was, make sure it's visible now, and then make sure it's in the right position. So what do we do in the end turn handler? So we'll just create that, turn end. Well, in the end turn handler, we want to do something similar with the visibility. So we check to see, is our item visible? First of all, tutorial visible. So if our item is visible, then we set our visible prior to end of turn flag to be true. So tutorial visible prior to end of turn is set equal to true. Oops. Like so. And then we make sure that we hide the user control, because we don't want to be shown over the end turn when the AI is processing its turns. So update, and then set it to false. However, this is a little bit different in that there's also an else part. So there's an if else, and this else part is if our tutorial if the image was not visible, then we just want to set the prior to end of turn visibility flag to false. So we just take this, we say this is false, and then that will handle showing or hiding our image depending upon whether or not it should be visible. So let's just recap. We have our declarations, the variables which will control our progress bar. We've got our constants for positioning our progress bar. We have our constructor where we set the local faction name, which is used to for creating our listeners, and also initialize our listeners and the UI elements. We then have our event handlers, which at the moment are just controlling the visibility of our user interface component. And then we have our functions for setting up our event listeners and for setting up the UI elements. And at this point, that's all we actually need. So let's save that off. So if you save it to a file called Warhammer _progressbar tutorial.lua. So I'll save that off. Now we need to go to our pack file. So I already have one open, and here it is, custom progressbar tutorial.pack. Now you don't have to call your pack file that. It's your choice what you call it. So what do we need in our pack file? Well, the first thing we need to do is create our directory structure for our images. So if you remember back in Notepad, our directory structure is UI skins tutorial. So we need a UI folder, and then under that is a skins folder, and under that is a tutorial folder. So let's create those. So you can right click, create folder, call that UI, and then we select that and right click, create folder, and then create the skins, and then the last part is create folder, and I believe it was tutorial. Okay, so now that we've got our directory structure for our images, we need to add them in. So you can right click on the tutorial folder and say add file. Now you need to go to wherever you saved your images from the first tutorial. So in my case, my images are in following directory. So you should eventually get to a screen like this where you've got your 10 different images for the different states of the progress bar. And then you can select the one in the top left hand corner, hold down your shift key, and then select the bottom right, and we'll get all of them. Just say open, and then they'll all be populated into the pack file. So here we have our different tiers. Excellent. So let's just quickly save that. So what else do we need? Well, now we need the directory structure for where our script file will live. So in this case, we go back to the very topmost item in the tree, select that, right click, say create folder, and this time the folder is going to be called script. Then say new, then we select our script folder, and we right click and create. We're going to create a folder called campaign, like so. And then we select our campaign folder, we right click and we create one more folder, and we call this one mod. Okay, and then on mod we've got two choices. We can either go add file and find the file that you just saved from Notepad++ and bring it in, or you can say create and create text file and then copy and paste from Notepad++ into here. Now I'm going to just do the create, and then we're going to call we need to make sure that when we do this create, the file name is the same as the name of the constructor. It's very important. So Warhammer progress bar underscore tutorial .lua. Okay, excellent. So we've got our blank text file. I'll just go to my Notepad++ and I'll select everything and copy it. Then go back to the pack file and paste it. So we now have our script in the pack file. So we've got our images, we have our script. We're ready to go. So what we need to do now is make sure that our pack file is saved to our Steam Games, Steam Apps, Common, Total War, Warhammer 2 data directory. So this is where the game will look for mods. So just save that, and I've already got one there, so I'll just override it. Now we can close that, and we go to Warhammer 2, and if everything worked out, it should show us a progress bar when we start up a campaign. So we go into the mod manager. This might take a little while to load, so I've got a few mods in my folder. It might take quite some time to load. Here we go. Okay, so you should find at the very bottom of your mod list, or near to the bottom, there will be a new one. In my case, it's custom progress bar tutorial, so it'll be whatever name you gave it. So we select to turn it on, and then click play. So once your Warhammer 2 is loaded, we just want to go to campaign, new campaign, and we'll go Mortal Empires. And it shouldn't really matter which lord you select, because we didn't specify a faction for our script to run under. So it should run under any faction. So let's just start with Tyrion. Okay, we're finally loaded. So if you look to your left and top left of the screen, you should find that our image has been overlaid on the campaign layout manager. So at this point, there is no tooltips or functionality. We can't do anything with it, apart from at the end of turn, it should hopefully hide itself and then display itself at the beginning of the next turn. So our user control was displayed on the campaign screen in the top left-hand corner without any issue. However, there was a small problem in that at the end of turn, it would not disappear. So we need to return to our script and discover what the issue is. Well, in this case, it's a minor issue and completely my fault, as I put in the wrong event for us to listen to. So it's not faction and turn, it's faction turn end. So now if we were to run Warhammer 2 again, our control would display, and when we end the turn, it will disappear. So let's save that off. Let's select all and copy. Go to our pack file, delete everything that's there, and paste the new one in, like so. Then save the pack file into the data directory. And now we run Warhammer 2. So our mod should already be selected in the mod manager, so we do not need to go back into there. So we can just go straight to play. So here we are on the campaign screen, and we can see that our user control is in the top left hand corner. The only thing that will happen is at the end of turn it should disappear, and at the beginning of turn it should reappear. So let's give that a go and see if everything is as it should be. So end of turn, there we go, disappeared. So the AI is now taking its turn, or turns. And taking its sweet time doing so. And here we are at the next turn, and we can see that our control has reappeared. And there we have it. Our user control is being displayed on the campaign screen and is being hidden and made visible at the end of turn and start of turn. And that's all we actually set out to do for this tutorial. In the next episode, we will take a look at resources and tying our progress bar into a resource behind the scenes, so that at the end of turn it will increment, and we can then see our different images start to get displayed as the tiers increase. So until then, I would like to thank you very much for joining me in this tutorial, and I hope to see you in the next one. As always, I would like to end the video with a shout out to my patrons. Thank you very much for the continued support. It was a special thanks to Hot Apple Pie and Cody Bonds. I'm Grey Tiger, and I'll hopefully see you next time.